All right, guys, video number 2 getting ready to kick off here, and we're going to kind of pick up the pace here a little bit so we can kind of get everything moving through as quickly as possible. But here we're going to start talking about innovation and innovation diffusion and how those processes are actually going to be working. It's going to harken back to some of that stuff on psychological distance and perceived spatial relationships and how those change as your station in life and your situation changes as well. Also get into a little bit about what's going on with disease spread and the types of contagious diffusion processes, and really just kind of talking about diffusion processes as well. And we'll go ahead and get it kicked off here, taking a look at this stuff. One of the things we look at is innovation. And innovation is just simply new ideas, new technologies, new ways of doing something. So it's a little bit more than just simply invention, which is coming up with something new. Innovation can also entail new ways of doing things or viewing things. And one of the things that we see is that generally high rates of innovation, high rates of invention are generally going to be taking place in areas that have high degrees of spatial interaction. The more people you have who are interacting with each other, the more ideas and technologies are exchanged, and new ways of doing things and new ideas develop out of those relationships. So this is something that we've seen. This is kind of behind the rise of Silicon Valley and the tech sector within the United States. But we've seen this historically happen throughout history. When we get into cultural geography toward the very end of the semester, we'll talk about this a little bit as well, but we'll also talk about it in urban geography because they're intimately related, because generally where there are high rates of spatial interaction are going to be in areas that have relatively high concentrations of population, and those are going to be generally metropolitan and urban centers. In the past, that was going to be, the culture hearth. So these are going to be places like in Samaria, in Mesopotamia, so in the Nile and in the Ganges River Valley in India, where you have early settlements that end up being the centers for culture and then innovation and ways of doing things. And so the origins, say, of domestication of animals or the domestication of particular crops, and then how those ideas and technologies diffuse out to populations. Those become extraordinarily important. There is a theory, and this kind of comes and goes, talking about the sort of the recent revolution in communication. So think high-speed internet and cell phone technology and things like this, that the traditional importance of cities might decline in the future. And I think what we're actually seeing with COVID is a little bit of that playing out. It really remains to be seen how much it does, or really how much. We're not really talking about the interactions or the spatial arrangement of people per se within an urban area changing too terribly much as we're seeing reconfigurations within those urban spaces of where people interact and how they interact, but also some more maybe movement of people, maybe not necessarily all the way out to the country, but making places like a Knoxville more attractive, right? So that Knoxville as a small city becomes part of the calculation for where people might want to live and then engage in various levels of interaction. And this can also be affecting Chattanooga or Bristol or a whole host of these smaller, medium-sized cities that have been kind of out interstitched in between the larger urban centers. But at the same time, we're seeing Nashville is booming, right? I don't know if you guys have been out to Nashville recently, but every time I'm through Nashville, we sort of play a game of how many cranes can you see on the horizon? And that's been going on for 4, 5, 6+ years pre-COVID. And I would say that even during COVID, it has, that amount of activity has not really abated very much. There is a lot of construction activity and a lot of people relocating and moving into the Nashville metropolitan area. Does that mean they're all concentrating downtown or that the patterns of spatial interaction aren't changing? No, it just means that there is an intensity of population that is moving into places like Nashville, but also Atlanta and other places. And those relationships are reinforced, but then new relationships emerge. And that's one of the things that we see over time. But we also then see these higher degrees of spatial interaction that are then associated with innovation over time. Other stuff that we start to see as well coming in are changes in activity space. Now, this gets back to what I was talking about in the first video a lot with that frictionless zone. So in a lot of ways, that frictionless zone is going to be this individual activity space. And again, that individual activity space, because that critical is going to be related to that critical threshold distance. And as that's different for each individual activity spaces are also going to be highly individualized. But this is where you get your territoriality. And it mentions, as it says, it's the activity space where people move freely on their rounds of regular activity, that frictionless zone, so to speak. And oftentimes it's going to be intimately associated with the journey to work as your activity space. So most of you might have a part-time job, but in this essence, your primary job is as a student, right? So your activity space is going to be intimately connected to Pellissippi State, whether that's at the Hardin Valley campus or if you're over on the campus in East Knoxville or down in Maryville or moving between all of those. That's going to start to define your activity space. And then you have your home, and then you might have your other activities that you engage with on a regular basis. But then you are oftentimes, almost all of us, going to be using the automobile. And so that automobile then changes those critical distances and the time spaces that we use as we activate through those individual activity spaces themselves when we're dealing with them. Some of the other stuff that we see going on is a variety of activity space changes that occur in individuals over time. And this is just simply the recognition that as you reach particular stages of life, you are going to be faced with different sorts of constraints on your time and on the range of activities that you are going to be able to engage in. And that then means your activity spaces are going to change as well. Okay, so as a child, your means of mobility are relatively limited, right? To walking, scooters, bicycles, things like that, and where you're allowed to move. As you get older, you'll start maybe being able to bicycle farther or walk farther, or you can take advantage maybe of some public transportation options that you didn't when you were, say, 5 or 6, until eventually you start to learn how to drive. And as you learn how to drive, suddenly a whole new world opens up and your activity spaces expand considerably. As you then start moving through school and into college, and then subsequently as you move into more actively into the workforce, your activity space is going to change again, oriented toward your home and your work. And as you might get married and then have children, your workspace and your activity space is going to change again. As your children then grow up, your activity space and moving them to various activities is then going to change your activity space. Once they leave the home, your activity space changes again. And then as you move toward retirement, your activity space will change again. And all during this time frame, you're going to have different access and usages for transportation. And that's going to change those critical threshold distances. All those things are going to change. So this thing is often in flux, and it's not particularly fixed. But we do see a lot of commonality in where people are at in their stage of life as far as what are the ranges of their opportunities. And so we see that there's a lot of change. And one of the things that's really interesting is how can we actually trace those changes through time and how people move through space, and how do those activity spaces change. One of the other things that gets back into that psychological concept of distance gets into mental mapping. So you have your mental map, you have your home range, you kind of know where everything is. You then have the surrounding areas that you don't maybe know necessarily as well, but you know enough to get through them easily. And then you've got the areas that you're not familiar with where you're having to actually really, think harder about where you're at, right? You're developing your mental map that you're going through there. And it's so how you perceive a place. It's kind of like, do you have some sort of sense to some extent of ownership over a particular place, right? That you are a member of a particular community or region area that's around in there. And so you basically are keying in on important things and those particular landmarks that define those spaces, and they help you to move through that space, and you build your mental maps accordingly. And here's how it looks like as we're looking at, same person, same child at different stages in life, right? So 6-year-old, well, what is her mental map? What is she aware of? What's her spatial cognition? Her home, and then the homes that are immediately around her. Why? She's not driving. She's maybe walking down to the bus, oftentimes probably accompanied by a parent. She's being ferried around, and she's really not paying much attention to her surroundings. What's immediately available to her is what she sees in her immediate surroundings. And when she becomes a 10-year-old, right, it expands out a little bit more to the neighborhood. And you can see sort of by the width of the drawing there that a lot of her time is actually spent in the alleyway. So the alleyway actually takes a much wider context, but she knows where some of the buildings and the houses are, maybe where her friends are, etc. And that's her neighborhood. So it's kind of where she can bike in her neighborhood and sort of what her bounds are, which are the 4 streets that are around in that area. And so she's kind of aware of that area, but what she knows is kind of what's immediate to her home and that surrounding area, and where does she actually move actively through that space. Then as a 13-year-old, she's starting to become more aware, right? She's probably engaging in more activities and things like that. So she knows her neighborhood, which is right there. This little rose box up here is this little pink box down here. And she's got a better idea of where the streets are, how things are, where the schools are, how to get to the schools, all those different things. So, she sees where all the different locations are and the names of some of the major streets that would get her there. And then we can assume that, say, when she gets 16 and has a car, that then all of a sudden a lot more detail is going to fill in, and that area is going to expand considerably because her range of available activity space is going to expand in tandem with her ability to drive and discover new places. She's not going to be constrained by where her parents can drive her or where she can get on a bicycle or available public transportation. So that's some of the stuff that we see with that. And this gets in as well into this notion. We've got that individual activity space. We'll get back into that a little bit, maybe a little bit later on. But really now we can kind of kick it off and get into this notion of diffusion and innovation. Your chapter is going to make a lot of this as you're reading through that. And basically all we're talking about is how does a concept or a practice or a substance, in this a substance you can think of as a good or a disease or whatever the case, how does it spread from its point of origin into new territories? Or how does it move from person to person to person? How does it essentially move through space? What is the means of conveyance and transmission of that concept, that idea, the practice, the substance through space? And when we are looking at spatial interaction, that's a lot of what geographers are looking at, is what is the diffusion process, or what is the physical structures by which that interaction is taking place. So it might be looking at the transportation networks, or what are the transportation network connectivities? How are they able to handle particular goods? How do those things move through space? All of that is part of understanding diffusion. It can also be into physical geography, right? How does magma move up from the center of the earth and fill in fractures and fissures in underground, and how do those fractures and fissures form? Right? So how does magma diffuse from one place to another? Or if it makes it to the surface, it becomes lava. How does it spread? Those things are also part of diffusion processes. The thing we could also look at is the spread of seeds. Or right, how does kudzu end up spreading throughout the entire southern part of the United States from where it originated to where it is now? And how does that happen? Those are all interesting sort of diffusion modeling exercises. So there's a variety of different ways we can look at that. Basically, in sort of 2 broad categories. There's contagious diffusion, and then there's hierarchical diffusion. Hierarchical diffusion is going to be associated more with human systems, okay? Contagious diffusion is going to be oftentimes across the board within human systems, but also a lot of natural processes that are going to be in there. And the thing is, there's not necessarily one is exclusive of the other. Contagious diffusion and hierarchical diffusion may exist over the same process or the same phenomena and over the same spaces and occurring at sort of the same time. It's just a different way of sort of explaining how these things happen. So when we see contagious diffusion, it's essentially the spread of one region, one spatial context through contact or exchange of information or some process of communication and contact that then picks that thing up and moves it, translates it, so to speak, from one location to another. And that can happen over time as well as over space. And we see this within mass media and advertising, which can actually speed along processes of communication. But think about it this way. There's a variety of different things that you can go out and look at on YouTube. I may actually have some of these links into content that I encourage you to go back out there and take a look at. So people have taken a look at like the spread of religion. So you can go back out there and you can find YouTube videos that say, give me some sort of a timeline of the diffusion or spread of Christianity through the Mediterranean. So you'd see it kind of start off in around Jerusalem, in the Levant, and you'd start to see it spread out, and it would work its way through North Africa and in through Europe, and then all of a sudden, boom, you'll see this increasing connection as like the Christian empires of Europe, France and England and the Netherlands and Germany, as they start spreading around in their own imperial systems, you start seeing Christianity spreading along with that. And so you see, the Americas become Christianized, etc., all across the world. But you also see it moving into Asia and a variety of places. Same thing, you can do the same for the spread of Buddhism and take a look at it originating in India and then moving into China and elsewhere throughout Asia and then elsewhere around the world. And all these different ways and how that spreads and the means by which it is spread are all part of these contagious diffusion processes in some way. And again, contagious is going to put you in mind of contagion, and that gets into the notion of how do, say, diseases spread, and also contact with people, movement through space, so like the bubonic plague. This is one of the things that we saw with hierarchical diffusion as well, which is this spread up or down an hierarchy of places. And we'll talk about this hierarchy of places when we get more into urban geography. But what you have large cities and medium-sized cities and smaller cities, and then down into smaller settlements that are out. And so there's this hierarchy of small to large or large to small, depending on how you want to look at it. And what hierarchical diffusion means is that it spreads from sort of the top down, or it can spread from the hinterlands into the central area. So what we have here are economic connections between different locations that are engaged or structured in an hierarchical manner, such that the bubonic plague, say, comes into Venice in Italy, coming in from locations in what's now Turkey and further east via a variety of different ships. Those ships might then also go to Genoa or into Spain or something. But because Venice is at a pillar at the time of economic activity in a large part of Europe, it then goes to the smaller cities that are associated with Venice, or smaller cities associated with the trade networks that are based out of Genoa, etc. And soon it starts to spread out, and all of a sudden, boom, it's starting to move from these larger cities into the smaller cities, but then also into other larger cities that are connected into Venice based off of trade relationships primarily. So the disease is moving as people are trading with each other, and the movement of trade goods, the disease is spreading along with those people. And then once those people become infected, then it's just simple human proximity and contact that also then spreads that disease out through the population. So we see that happening as well a lot with both an hierarchical diffusion of large city to smaller city or wherever that might be happening, and then a contagious diffusion within those places along that hierarchy that's going in. And that puts us in mind then of medical geography. This is a little bit new that your book decided to kind of go ahead and point this out, but it's primarily sort of in response to modern diseases that have been spread because they can spread very rapidly globally. Take a look at that. Before COVID had really kind of taken off, and your book is kind of doing this in response to COVID primarily. But there were some additional diseases that were out there that were coming, say, out of Africa in particular locations And then the big thing that actually really caught a lot of people's attention within medical geography and disease spread was the spread of AIDS or HIV, starting 20, 30 years ago, and how that disease would move from hierarchically from big city to big city to big city, and then within those cities in sort of a contagious diffusion process. And so those are some of the ways that we can look at disease and how it moves, that's in there. They'll also look at processes of access to healthcare and things like that, although your book isn't going to concentrate on that too much. But that's actually a big area as well, is who is connected to the health system in what way. And there's a lot of stuff that's being done right now that you could look at. And I think some of you guys, as I recall, kind of took a look at some of this when we were talking about the spatial diffusion processes a couple weeks ago as part of your discussion, looking at access to healthcare and how healthcare itself is actually, the provision of it is oftentimes a diffusion process, particularly within technology and medical technology that might be out there. But you have a couple different things, the way we can look at these diseases: agents, hosts, and the environment, and how those things work together. So you have the disease. You need to have agents or the means of communication, the hosts who have the disease, and then an environment that's conducive to the transmission of that disease. And so once you have those in place, that disease will then spread. This is just a nice map of contagious diffusion. So we sort of have our infected person down here in the bottom left, and they get sort of the three nearest people, right? Because spatial interaction is going to happen most often with the people who are closest to you. And we then see how these ideas, this contagious spread. So this could be a disease spread model, but it can also be ideas, concepts, technologies that also spread, right? So this guy down here becomes the initial adopter for some fancy new app on his phone and shows his closest friends or guys who are near him, and they say, "Oh, that's neat." And then pretty soon what happens, they're communicating that to everybody, and that idea propagates, right? So, look at it this way. Not everybody was on Facebook when Facebook started, right? So how did that happen? Well, you had Facebook, and then you had some adopters, and then it spread, and it moved through rapidly. Same thing for TikTok or Instagram or any of these other sort of internet apps that are going on out there. You've got early adopters, and then the idea about that spreads, word of mouth or communication, and so then it eventually fills in to where almost everybody is now infected by some sort of desire to post videos on TikTok or Twitter, their latest deep thoughts out to everybody. So there we have it, with those different diffusion processes that are going on. This is also showing sort of how diffusion can move through space and time, or the temporal factor of it. This is there was a big influenza pandemic in 1781. Fairly typical that there would be these periodic large influenza, new types of influenza that would develop. And so here you can see that it started off in Eastern Europe and started off and basically spread as it moved westward by contact through trade and just general communication with people and moving in both contagiously and hierarchically. You can see that it was spreading month by month by month and moving westward and westward and westward until eventually it got all the way into Spain in about 8 months. And you got to remember it's 1781, so there's not extensive technology to move people very quickly. There are no railroads at this time. So this is moving essentially by horse and wagon and by ship across these spaces. One of the other things that we see is just this innovation. This is adoption, okay? This is the famous S curve because it has this S shape to it. And so this is the number of adopters at any given time. So here we have our early adopters, very close to when, say, an invention or technology or something comes about. And then as time passes, right, more and more people pick up on it. There's this fairly rapid growth. And then at some point, pretty much your entire user community, or everybody who's going to adopt that technology or that idea, has done so. And that becomes this flattening of the S curve. One of the other things we might see is there might be a fall off on that curve to where people abandon that technology. I don't know how many of you still have. So a good example on this is the evolution and diffusion of ideas of music technology. And there used to be a variety of different ways of listening to music back in the day, and we've gone through a variety of different means of doing that. But there used to be LP records, which would be hard plastic or later vinyl technology. But there would be 78 RPM records, RPM being revolutions per minute. So this would be the speed at which the record would turn that would be in there. You would have 45 singles, and then the most common one that came about, that was sort of the ubiquitous one that won out over time, was the 33 and a third, and that diffused its way all over the world. Well, what supplanted the LP record started having things like cassette tapes, and then CDs, and then DVDs eventually, which were sort of a modification of CD technology. But then MP3s, and then MP4s, and now streaming, cloud, based musical diffusion and things like that. So Spotify's and all that sort of stuff. Okay. All of that means that what? Most people nowadays are not getting their music via LPs. There's a aficionado segment that's still out there that goes for the old vinyl records and things like that. So there's still a market, but it is not the overwhelming majority of music sales or listening, that people, when people are listening at home, that's not the primary means by which they are doing so via vinyl. It's other technologies now that have supplanted this. So this is actually one of the things we can look at, which is the change of technology over time as well. I don't know how many of you guys remember Netscape. Probably none of you remember Netscape. Netscape was the largest browser around. Okay, so it was a browser that was in there, and it's sort of the precursor to Google Chrome. But even Chrome came up, and now there's more and more browsers that are coming out there now. I use Linux now a lot on my stuff, and so a couple of the browsers that are out there now working well for Linux, they're being encouraged. One called Vivaldi, there's another one called Brave, and even Opera is still kind of a nice alternative beyond, say, Firefox or whatever the latest Internet Explorer Edge version is out there, as well as Google Chrome still out there. So there's a variety of different things, which mean what? A whole host of potential innovations that can be adopted or rejected by people globally across the board. So that's some of the other stuff that we see as well. And this gets into this whole notion of how we deal with technology and the ubiquity of cell phones, communication satellites, almost to the extent now that we have too many satellites up in space that they're starting to crash into each other, not leaving a whole lot more space for new satellites to be launched. But this gives us the ability to communicate with people globally almost instantaneously, which results in sort of a space-time convergence. And if we can communicate adequately with people, or particularly if we can use Zoom or Teams or some other means, to WebEx to communicate visually with each other, we also then don't necessarily have to engage in the cost to meet with each other. Then we're just basically working out what's a convenient schedule to where we're not having to be up at 2:00 in the morning in order to have a conversation with somebody who is, 8 hours time difference away from us. But this also is leading to other things where telecommuting, where people can actually work from home a lot. And also this notion of footloose industries or footloose occupations, where people don't have to be in a centralized location in order to do the jobs that they're doing on a daily basis. And so this is still very much kind of something that's been affected by COVID and has been enabled by advances in technology that we're still seeing kind of play out. We don't really know where this is going to end up or how that's actually going to maybe transform urban locations or cities. And like I said, right now we're seeing a lot of movement into these smaller cities that might have a higher quality of life for a lot of people, depending on what it is that they value, and they can still end up being connected to other places and ideas and things with other people. This is just the map of the hierarchical diffusion as it's working from first level, second level, third level, fourth level, and centers of population. And we'll get more into what these hierarchies look like when we get into urban geography in a few weeks. Here's also your activity spaces that are going on, and how just the notion that the automobile allows us to have greater or more spatially separated activity spaces. So we kind of look at this pattern of movement. This is a fairly typical movement pattern that measures, so people leave their home, they go shopping, to the business, recreation, work, school, things like this, all around, and primarily driven by the automobile. And again, we'll talk about this in urban geography a little bit more, is the transformation or the configuration of the urban environment in relationship to the automobile, which is primarily a US and Canadian phenomena, and not so much what's going on in Europe or elsewhere around the globe. Now, this one is actually really neat. This is sort of the diffusion of Walmart that's going on in here. And so this kind of just shows the spatial spread over time of Walmart throughout the United States. So some really interesting stuff. This next one here is, I'm not going to show this. I'm going to actually put this link into the content for you that's in there, or you can just type this in, follow this. This will actually show you the movement and the map across time. Just so in the interest of saving time, I'm just going to go ahead and leave it here on this. But it's really neat to actually show sort of the individual points of the individual stores and the spread of Walmart. So I'll drop that link into the content as well for you guys to go back in and take a look at. So I encourage you to kind of take a look at that. It's only a couple minutes long, so it won't take you too much time. But I'm going to leave it here, and we'll pick up with another video talking about migration. Thanks, guys.